We've probably all felt this while watching a fantasy show or movie, or perhaps while reading a book. This feeling that this piece of media just lacks a soul, uniqueness, that it's too bland or just not getting to you emotionally, but in a very specific, weird way. In short, it feels generic. This feeling is naturally not exclusive to the fantasy genre, far from it. Detrimental similarities between works covers pretty much all genres, and yet it is the fantasy genre that seems to suffer the most, or at least more obviously. To start, I think this subject can be examined in two levels. The first is practicality, and the second is depth. Starting with the first, and arguably most obvious, fantasy, more than other genres, has grown incredibly homogeneous. As a foundation, I think it is quite obvious that fantasy has been radically influenced by the success of The Lord of the Rings, and by extension, Tolkien's own personal influences that preceded The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's work had a massive impact on all cultural levels, whether it be on other books, or even popular tabletops such as D&D and later Warhammer, which themselves produced products in other media. These, with their own twists, eventually built on top of the fantasy genre of Tolkien, and would go on to massively impact even more creators on an even larger scale, from video games to movies and everything in between. Now, the fantasy genre that was popularized by Tolkien was a direct result of Tolkien's own medievalism and engagement in mythopoeia, or myth-making, as well as an attempt to create, or rather reconstruct, a medieval mythology for England. Tolkien's work was imbued by his own personal concerns, his religion, his thoughts on life and death, good versus evil, etc. On a surface level, however, what we can clearly see is a medieval-inspired society inhabited by numerous fantastical races, with their own unique traits and histories. This world also had mysterious supernatural elements that Tolkien chose not to explain in exact terms. Simply put, magic. Within this medieval, magical, and fantastical setting, we also have an array of characters participating in a quest to save the world, perhaps even a surface-level chosen one plotline. From these simple and superficial descriptions, we can begin to form a picture that could also describe countless other fantasy works. Middle Ages, Chosen One, magic, fantastical races, more often than not, directly copied from The Lord of the Rings. And especially the elves, orcs, and Peter Jackson's depiction of the dwarves. Speaking of which, the incredible popularity of the Jackson trilogy further exacerbated this effect. Lastly, if you look for it, you may also find tropes of rightful kings, large battles of good versus evil for the salvation of the world, and an innocent society plagued by the expansion of darkness. Of course, Tolkien did not really invent any of this. He was simply the primary example that would go on to influence the masses. And even then, this does not mean that being inspired by Tolkien and following him on every one of these matters is a bad thing. He did not have an eternal right to these tropes. What he did do, however, was imbue compelling, deeply human and emotional themes into his work. Themes that would transcend any superficial description of his work, even if it came out 1,000 years into the future and wasn't the one that made it popular. Sacrifice, the question of God, faith in your friends, treachery, greed, the cost of war, and I could keep going. All of these themes expertly intertwined in a compelling plot for the salvation of the world. If The Lord of the Rings was put against a work that precisely copied its work and fantastical elements, but lacked the human depth portrayed within it, it would and does win in a landslide. When The Lord of the Rings came out, it was not the standard. It was something paradoxically fresh when you consider its archaic character. Its themes, however, were timeless, and even in the present day, when The Lord of the Rings as the genre's main grandfather is the definition of standard and generic, it still manages to capture new readers or moviegoers, even though people may be tired with seeing medieval fantasy over and over again. Therefore, practically speaking, the superficial fantasy matters a lot. If the reader has seen the same thing again and again, they will begin to recognize patterns and get bored. Something that goes beyond the practical is required, something deeper, something so strong that it renders everything else as secondary to it, as something that supports it, but not the focus of the work. A new book coming out today whose sole purpose is to present to the reader a new fantasy race the author made up, or a new interpretation of the elves, may get an audience that enjoys it, but I doubt it would get very far. We've seen elves before, and we've seen weird fantasy creatures before, so what's new? The fantasy needs to be secondary to the fiction that has to be well thought out in order to captivate. For example, The Witcher is perhaps one of the most generic fantasy settings out there. The author himself has claimed that the Witcher world is of secondary importance. It is simply a supporting character whose purpose is to assist the plot. Any lore that is written exists for the purpose of the plot, not for its own sake. Its fantasy creatures are interesting, but the Polish readers it was meant for were quite used to it. The dynastic plots aren't particularly intricate, and the rest are standard fantasy magic, elixirs, and races such as elves and dwarves. What makes The Witcher captivating, therefore, isn't really its fantasy elements. It's The Witcher's grit, darkness, moral ambiguity, and themes of betrayal and human error, of human savagery, of prejudice, and the reality of the human condition. The Witchers are cool as a concept, but what gets me is how Sapkowski portrays their interaction to society. Pariahs, hated by the very humanity they seek to protect, but not without coin. Now, everything we've mentioned so far has concerned the difference between bad or good fantasy within literature. Visual media, such as games, movies, or TV shows, have an even larger problem. Visual media forces you into a very specific perspective. You view what is in front of you. You don't imagine Aragorn atop his horse, ready to give everything up at the Black Gate in order to buy Frodo some time. The fact that the Jackson trilogy was able to convey this in a well-received way does not mean it is the rule. In fact, it may very well be the exception. Fantasy's superficial things we talked about require time, large budgets, and intelligent ways to produce quote-unquote magic in order to make them believable or even acceptable. And, as we have already established, these superficial things are not even what makes a fantasy work good, something that is not easy to do to begin with. In a fantasy show like The Witcher on Netflix, for example, after it diverged from the books, if you take away the themes and the heart of the story and its characters, what you have left are very average-looking fantasy VFX, CGI creatures, and cliché medieval society. That right there is what feels generic. And it's because this phenomenon is so common within the fantasy genre, and because the fantasy genre is as popular as it is because of the good works it has produced, that fantasy has gotten this reputation, and the generic criticism is so common. My last argument to prove it is, of course, the Rings of Power. Within it, although there are massive lore changes, you can still find Tolkien's creations: Numenor, Elendil, the Noldor, Sauron, and more. And yet, Tolkien it is not. Tolkien's heart and themes and concerns are not in it, and all that is left are these superficial fantasy things. Vaguely medieval, it has fantastical races, characters that are called the same name as Tolkien's characters, and sometimes pretty good CGI magic and creatures. It's technically Tolkien, but actually fantasy slop that you can only describe as, you guessed it, generic. And that is why, because paradoxically, fantasy must come secondary to the work, something oftentimes either forgotten or pursued inadequately. In the end, the creatures, the magic, the made-up worlds and languages are what makes fantasy, fantasy. But what makes good fantasy is everything in between. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.